Alright guys, so welcome, and for today's study session what we're going to be talking about is identifying player types for optimal play. This is essentially the basis of all these new, more exploitable strategies, or not necessarily exploitable strategies, but in terms of playing optimally. Essentially that's what we should all be after, is optimal play. For those that have known me long enough, in the poker world, and some new faces here, you hear me talking all about you have to change your game, especially in today's games overall, no matter what game you're playing, because quite simply there are more players at the tables, no matter what stakes you're playing, that understand the basic strategy of playing sit and goes. Again, no matter whether you're playing 6 max or 180 man games, and anywhere in between. So you're always still going to have your bad players, your unknown players, guys you've never seen before, and then you're also going to have guys that you have seen before, you see on an everyday basis, and they are winning players. And the issue that I think most people have in terms of achieving their maximum profitability is changing up their game based upon those different player types. So we're going to talk today more about some general strategies, because this concept is so broad, really, that we could be here for hours having conversations about specific hands and what to do in this situation. So I'm essentially going to give you some quick tips, some general strategies to use. We're going to go through some scenarios that were posed to me. One was in the forum. I was also given some hands, and just talk about how to approach the different scenario. What do you want to do at the table to play that more optimal game? And so why don't we just jump into it, and start the discussion of what does that really mean in terms of playing optimally. So playing optimally means that you need to know when to change your strategy from unexploitable to exploitable and back and forth. Okay? And if you guys have any questions about this, obviously as I'm talking, just fire away with any questions that you have. But this is really, like you'll see at the top here, the foundation for everything that we're going to be talking about. For example, when I was playing a lot more on PokerStars, and I was mainly playing the 18-man games, and also on Full Tilt, those were games that got pretty reg infested quickly at the $15 and $30 level, and obviously that's still going on right now in those games. However, I'm now playing on different networks. The Merge Network, Revolution Network, and the general player pool is so much different. Those 18-man games used to get pretty reg infested, so I had to use those exploitable strategies, all the strategies that you may have seen in the Crush the Reg series. Those are the strategies that I needed to use in those games more often to get an edge over the other guys, rather than playing that basic ABC strategy. However, now that I'm playing on these other networks, they're not reg-infested tables. Okay, they are tables full of random players, guys that are massive losing players, for whatever reason. But I don't really care what the reason is. The point is that I need to recognize that and essentially go back to the unexploitable, straightforward strategy that we probably all learned the game with. Because the reason, when I say unexploitable, ABC, basic strategy, whenever I use those adjectives, I don't mean to put that strategy down, because that strategy is a winning strategy, and it was definitely a more profitable strategy a couple of years ago, especially on PokerStars. And I talk about it, and maybe it seems like demeaning, like, oh, you're playing an ABC strategy. ABC strategy just means you're playing a solid, straightforward game. You're making plus EV moves. And those strategies were developed really when a lot of other players had no idea about ICM. They had no idea about proper strategy. You had to play tight in the early game, have a proper push-fold range, understanding Nash ranges, all that stuff. So those strategies were developed for that game. And obviously as the game has evolved, players have gotten better, a lot of other people understand that strategy, so we need to deviate and use these more exploitable strategies. But playing on Merge and Revolution and the winning network, those older strategies are actually the ones that are probably best. The exploitable strategies, which I've touted as being more profitable, being the ones you want to use more often, those aren't the strategies that I'm using on an everyday basis because I can't. So I bring this up because it's important to know who's at your table, who the players are, what kind of table it is. Obviously, you want to look at stats to know when to jump back and forth. Because yes, while I'm playing a very straightforward game on these networks, if there happen to be some regs to my left, I need to know how to turn my game around really quick and start using exploitable strategies to get an advantage over them even more and use these more profitable strategies. Let's keep going. So the key is, guys, I give that example because you need to know it's purely based upon the players that you're at your table. You need to know when to jump back and forth between each strategy. And when you do, that's when you'll be playing optimally. And then that's what we're going to go through today about certain things to identify in certain players and what strategies to use. Because essentially, in the members portal, all these videos, all the discussions that we have in the Skype group, we start talking about different strategies. I put them together so that you can, that's like part of your arsenal of plays. Like if you go into every game and you've got all these different plays to make, you need to figure out which is the best one. And that's purely player dependent, obviously situation dependent, depending on the game, stack sizes, all that stuff. But really, sorry about that. That's always fun. You need to know, like I said, when to use which strategy. So that's what we're going to talk about today. When you identify a certain player, when to do certain things. So as you'll see here, I say identify the players at your table ASAP, especially the players to your left, because that's going to be key. If I'm sitting at a table, if I sit down at a 9-man table or whatever, and I look and I've got 4 guys to my left that are randoms, or I've never seen before, or maybe I have seen them before and I have stats on them and they're playing 45-10 and 36-13. By the way, those are very normal stats for the guys that I'm facing on these other networks. I need to know what my strategy is for that game. I know for that entire game, these guys are going to be to my left and how I should be playing. So what does that mean? I'm going to be playing that basic strategy. Pretty tight early on, just playing good hands, because I know that I'm going to be playing post-flop a lot against them when I open. So if I'm going to be playing out of position, I want to play good hands. And when I have 12 big blinds or less, I'm probably playing a push-fold game. Okay? I talk so much about adopting a more raise-fold, raise-call strategy that you've seen in the Crush the Reg series and the other videos, but that strategy is probably the inferior strategy when you've got 3 guys to your left or 4 guys that are capable of flatting you. The last thing I'm going to do is open up with 10 big blinds with ace-queen, get called, go to the flop, miss, make a c-bet. Now I'm down to what? 6 big blinds. So that's not the situation you want to find yourself in. You want to play a solid push-fold game, understand your ranges when those types of players are at your table. When you have a reggy table, a tighter table, you can use a lot of different strategies. But the point is that that you should be adding in. That basic strategy, it's not going to be as profitable because the regs, they understand proper push-fold ranges. They're not going to flat you and play post-flop. So we want to use what we know against those players. And obviously you can look at your HUD stats, and I promote using a HUD a ton now, because when I add it into my own game, it increased my ROI over 4 percentage points in the 18-man games. And from like a 4 to 6% ROI in the 9-man games to a 10 to 12% now. So I played for a really long time without a HUD, but now for a while now I've been using one, and I'm a huge proponent of it. But I want to bring up 2 things. One is, what if you don't have a HUD still? That's fine. 2, what if you have a HUD but you don't have a lot of stats on players? I encourage you to, 1, take notes. I didn't write that down here, but obviously take notes. But 2, also use Shark Scope. Okay, use SharkScope. Even if you have 5 free searches, you don't have a subscription. Who cares? Use SharkScope. Use Poker Pro Labs. That'll get you another 5 or 10 searches, whatever they do. If you have a player at your table you've never seen before, or maybe they're at a bunch of your tables now, look them up. Simply knowing if they're a winning player or not can instantly give you an idea of their ranges. Okay, if a guy shoves under the gun for 10 big blinds, and I don't know him, but I look him up and he's a winning player, I could pretty much give him a relatively solid range of hands that he's going to be shoving. If I look him up and he's a random player that doesn't have winning stats or isn't a good player, then actually that range is probably more unknown, but it's probably not the correct range either. A lot of players, you're right, Paul, do not opt in, but that'll tell you 2 things. One is, if they're not opted in and maybe they haven't played a lot of games, then you're up against a random opponent. Okay, then just pay a little bit of attention to the players, see what they're doing, and start to get an idea of who you're up against. Are they 3xing and 4xing? Are they doing things that other winning players would not do? And the other thing is, you can also look at their ability. If they have played 10,000 games and their ability is a 45, that'll tell you they're a losing player. Okay, but if they have 10,000 games played and their ability is a 70, they're probably a winning player. So understand all the little variables to look at to just get an idea of who you're up against, because that's what it's all about. I mean, don't you want to know who you're playing against at the tables? Yes, we can probably play that unexploitable strategy that no matter who you're up against, it's going to put you in good position to profit. But I don't care about profiting. I want to make the most profit possible. I want to have the maximum ROI. That's what we're going after. So anything I can do to identify the players, I will do. That's why I have the HUD set up the way I have it. That's why I color code and take notes on players. That's why I'm always looking players up on SharkScope. And again, if you are using HUD stats, that's great. But take notes on players too. It doesn't allow you to then stop taking notes. It's one thing if you know a guy might be loose. It's another thing if you see him shove a really wide range from a middle position, let's say, and you can note exactly what his hand is. Once you start finding the bottom of somebody's range in, let's say, 3-betting spots or all-in spots in general, you can just start dominating that player, because then you can take a note on him, say what range, 10 big blinds, he shoved this hand from this position. You can get an exact calling range versus that opponent. So even if you're playing too many tables at the time to take notes, obviously no caddy can help, but if you want to get better and you want to outperform the other players, after your games, after your sessions, and I've talked about this in other videos, go into your Hold'em Manager or Poker Tracker, filter out your hands against those players, and take notes after the fact. Okay, I used to do that a ton, because I just wanted as much information about my opponents as possible. So, like I said, this is the foundation for everything, knowing your opponents. But it's one thing to know who your opponents are. It's then the next step is understanding how to play against those opponents. Okay, and that's usually what everybody misses. A lot of other strategy sites, videos, they'll talk about having a solid push-fold range, whatever it is. But the thing is, you should really be changing up your game based upon those opponents. So far, any questions on that? Make sense so far, or any questions? I just want to stress essentially how important it is that you know who's at your table, especially the guys to your left, because they're the ones that you're going to be raising through. Okay? So I'll talk about some essentially like general rules of thumb in the next slide. I think are like some quick tips on what you can do, and then we'll get into some specific scenarios and some hands to show how you can change up your game. So, like I said before, versus the whatever you want to call them. I know some people say, "Oh, you shouldn't call them fish." Whatever. A losing player, an unknown player. I typically want to play the unexploitable ABC style against them in general. There are things we can do to exploit their tendencies, but overall, what I mean is, let's say you have 11 big blinds and you're on the cutoff. Well, versus a reggie table, I might play a raise fold, raise call game there with 11 big blinds from the cutoff or from the button. Versus random players, like if I look to my left and I'm in the cutoff and I've got three guys who are randoms, or I looked them up on SharkScope and they're losing players, or I see that their stats are out of the norm for what a typical reg will have. Maybe they're, again, 35-30, something like that. Well, the reason we want to play the unexploitable ABC style is because we really don't know how they're going to react to our raise. Sometimes they're going to flatten you, sometimes they're going to 3-bet with a crazy range. The fact is that you don't really know what they're going to do. And because you don't know, there's really nothing to exploit. So you want to make a play that you know is plus EV. Okay, so if I'm sitting there with ace-8, maybe versus the unexploitable players, I'm going to shove that hand. But versus the, maybe there's three tight regs to my left, maybe I'll raise fold with that hand instead. Because I know that raise folding might be better than shoving. But if I raise through the loose players, they might flat me, I might have to go play post flop, which you really don't want to do when you're sitting with 10 or 11 big blinds. Versus tight regs to your left, you know you're not going to play post flop, so that makes life a lot easier. Okay, and I'm kind of just pulling examples out, but I want to show you that depending on the players to your left, even with the same exact hand, the same exact scenario, same exact stack size, I'm going to deviate my play based upon those players. And you know, like in the next bullet point here, I say you can use those exploitable strategies versus the regs because we know essentially how they're supposed to play. Okay, read any sit and go strategy book, any basic strategy video on how you're supposed to play. We can use that against them. So that's why I said maybe with ace-8 we can, from the cutoff, we can raise fold versus the regs because they're not going to play post flop. Their 3-betting range might be really tight, and it's going to crush ace-8. So long term, playing a more raise fold, raise call game is much more profitable way to play versus those regs. So, like I said, I'm getting into some generalities here to kind of just get you to overall, think at the tables. And it sounds simple, but what a lot of people do is, I think they've, over the past year or so, they've gotten out of the thinking mode, and they get more into the robotic mode of I'm going to load up 16 tables, I'm going to look at my hand, I'm going to make the play that I know is an okay play. Well, when you start actually thinking and getting out of the push-fold robotic play and start thinking about your opponents and the best way to handle your opponents, that's when you're going to see your ROI increase because you're going to be playing the optimal game. You have to think, what is the best way to play against my opponent based upon what I know? Okay, if you know the players to your left are really tight, use that against them. You don't need to play a push-fold game. You can do the raise-fold, raise-call game. And if you're not as familiar, I know, like I said, I know there's some new faces here. If you're not as familiar with this concept of the raise-fold, raise-call, I encourage you to watch the Crush the Reg series that I put together. That provides essentially the foundation for these exploitable strategies. So if you're not as familiar with those exploitable strategies yet, watch that series, then watch some of the concept videos as well. Especially in the small blind play, the mid-game strategy. That gets into a lot of the, how to play against the regs and how to play in an exploitive manner. So that's when you know what your opponent is doing. But if you don't know, look, sometimes you're going to be at the table and you're going to have no idea how your opponent plays. You're going to, maybe they'll flatten you, maybe they'll do all sorts of wacky stuff. If you don't know something about a player, you can't put them on a pretty precise range, then play the straightforward game. Err on the side of being more conservative. For example, let's say you're facing an all-in and you have to decide whether to call with, I don't know, King 10, okay, for like 10 big blinds. And you look it up in Sit and Go Wizard or ICMizer, and you give your opponent a range, and King 10 shows you that it's profitable by 0.01%. So it's almost like a break-even call, or maybe slightly more profitable. But remember, that's based upon a defined range of your opponent, which we've already said, maybe you don't know what his range is. So when you're analyzing your game and you're looking back and you say, hey, was this King 10 call appropriate? Oh, well, Sit and Go Wizard says it is based upon this range. Well, what if that range is slightly tighter? That makes that King 10 from a profitable call to a negative EV call. So my point is that when you're facing unknown scenarios, especially when you're going to be risking your entire stack, like you're in an all-in situation where you have to call a raise or call a 3-bet, err on the side of being conservative if you don't know your opponent's range. Okay? If you open up from the button and the same guy 3-bets you 4 times in a row, I think we can make the assumption that he's probably 3-betting wider than average. So that's the type of information you want to use to your advantage, and then start widening your calling range. So that's how you want to start changing up your game, but only when you know. One thing that has been expressed to me, for people that have gone through the series, have done coaching with, one of the actual common concerns that people have eventually is when they use some of these exploitable strategies, is that people are going to pick up on them. Okay, I feel I'm getting 3-bet too much. And that might happen. You play against a guy every single day for a year, sure, they're probably going to pick up on your tendencies after a while. Okay? But the important point is that you need to know that they're capable of exploiting you or picking up on your play before you start changing it. Don't fall into the trap of making the assumption that you feel somebody might be exploiting you or you feel that they might be wider. If we're going to use the example of you raise and they 3-bet you, I'll get to you. That's a good question, Albert. I'll get to your question in a second. If we take the example of, let's say you raise from the button and there's a reg in the small blind and he 3-bets you, and you're opening up with 7 deuce offsuit. If he does it to you once, don't all of a sudden feel that he's exploiting you or that he knows what you're opening with. The way you can obviously know if players are exploiting you is if their frequency of 3-betting goes up significantly versus you, or quite simply you see the hand that they 3-bet you with. Okay? That's the only time you should really start changing up your ranges. Okay? And again, look back at using your database of hands, look at the opponents, see if they're playing back at you, for example. And again, if we're going to be talking about 3-betting, if you're using Hold'em Manager 2, there's a great stat in there I've talked about before, is the versus hero stat. 3-bet versus hero. If you want to start changing up your game, look at that stat and see if somebody is actually 3-betting you wider than they're 3-betting everybody else. Okay, so you can use that stat. Albert, you said a player typically never changes his range. Are you saying when playing back at us, or let's say they're shoving into us, or if we talk about this 3-betting scenario, is that what your question is referring to? Are they never 3-betting a different range versus us? I'm still a little bit confused about what you're asking, but I'll say in general, players will change their range. I mean, if you're playing against an opponent every single day, he's a reg, and you have thousands of hands on him, sure, those players might change their range based upon how they perceive you. It's always important to understand how you're perceived by other players. But what I would say is about 95% of players out there very rarely will truly exploit your plays if we're talking about other regs. And I've talked about this in other videos in terms of, for somebody to, again, we'll talk about the opening ranges, because that's an easy concept to talk about. When we open wide and we use the raise fold, raise call concept, and potentially opening up with any 2 cards, the way for that strategy to be exploited is for an opponent to 3-bet you very wide and very frequently. Okay? But until you know that, that's the only time you should be changing your range. They might change their 3-betting range once or twice if you're really loose in a particular game, but you want to figure out if they're doing it every single game. That's when they're exploiting you in every single game. So you asked about similar situations. Is a same range. What I do is if I'm up against regs, I'll give them an average range that I know what a normal reg would play from there. And if I know any further information, I'll use that. Um, but the best thing to do is always put in an average range, and then based upon the opponent, what their stats are, deviate that maybe tighter or looser, and seeing what hand will perform well. And this is actually what the edge will help you do in Sit and Go Wizard. If you're unsure about a range, you want to make sure you're making a plus EV play. You give yourself a more positive edge to make sure that um, you're giving yourself a plus EV cushion. If that makes sense. See another question coming in, so fire away. Well, see that this is a question I don't really want to get into because you ask what's the ICM in these kinds of spots with King 10. I was using King 10 as a pure broad example, just saying, hey, maybe it's a call, maybe it isn't. Let's just say it's a plus EV call. I can't answer this question because there are several factors to consider. The other stacks at the table, where are we in the game, what's the ICM tax, what game is it, obviously who the player is that'll get us the range. So that's an impossible question to answer because we need to know all those other variables. I was just using it as a pure example to show if you're analyzing a King 10 hand that might be on the borderline of a plus EV call, well, that borderline is purely based upon your predefined range of your opponent. If that range is off, which it usually is, you're never really going to be 100% about an opponent's range, then um, you might want to eliminate the bottom, that King 10, from your calling range if it's just borderline. Um, you want to make what you know are plus EV plays when you're risking your entire stack and you're versus an unknown opponent, let's say. Does that make sense? All right. So I'll get into some quick tips and how to change your game in these very common scenarios, and then we'll get into some specific hands to go through. So I just really just top of my head wrote out some specific or some general scenarios and how I might deviate my play. So let's say you're playing versus there's a loose passive player in the blinds. Okay, you have 15 big blinds. You're in the small blind versus a 15 big blind stack in the big blind, um, and he's playing 30 and 10. Okay, and you have a marginal hand like 9-10 offsuit or something. What do you do? Do you fold? Do you raise? The limp steal might be a way to actually exploit what we know about that player. He's loose. He's passive. If we raise, we might be playing. He's likely to call us. We're going to play out of position, which is never a situation you're really going to love. You're too deep to shove. So, but do I always want to fold against this player? If you're folding nonstop in the blinds, you're just giving away chips. I'm always looking for a way to steal the blinds, so I look for the path of least resistance. So maybe the limp steal will work. And again, refer to the small blind video, or I believe it's the third video of the Crush the Reg series, where I talk about the concept of limp stealing and why to do that. Let's talk about 3-betting spots versus randoms or fishy players, and they raise, and you have the determination whether to 3-bet them or not. Usually versus random players, I'm 3-betting a value range. I'm not 3-bet bluffing, because while they might be bad players and opening up a poor range and maybe calling a really wide range, the last thing I want to do is 3-bet bluff and they snap me off with ace-4 and I'm behind. Okay? So I don't like to 3-bet bluff against them typically. I'm going to be 3-betting a value range versus their exact range. I'm not going to get into the exact ranges because we can play that game all day. But what if it's 20%? What if it's 30%? So you want to essentially look for solid hands to 3-bet because more often than not you might be going to showdown. Um, and especially if I'm out of position, I'm in the blinds, and let's say they open from middle position, and I'm going to 3-bet. 3-betting small is usually not going to be a great situation to put yourself in as well, because they'll probably flat you, and then again you're out of position. It gets really nasty. Obviously, if you don't have pocket aces or something like that, really easy to play. You ask, I don't know how to play in the small blind versus aggro fish. They don't fold a pair. They're the typically tougher ones to play against. The guys that might be playing like 35-30, loose and aggressive, are the tougher ones to play against. If you limp, they're going to raise over top of you. If you raise, they're either going to flat you or they 3-bet you. So I'm probably going to play pretty straight up against them. Raise my good hand, shove it, what I know is a plus EV range if I'm in push-fold mode. But again, just fold out the trashy hands. Okay? Right. Limping versus them, the aggro players, isn't going to work. So that's what I mean. That's not a strategy to use against them. Okay? If you know that they're aggressive, then why would we want to limp? We want to do it versus the loose passive guys. Okay? Sometimes you just have to fold. Sometimes you just have to fold. And that's okay. Folding might be the most plus EV play that you can make. Even if folding is negative EV because you're giving up your chips, is it less negative EV than raising or limping? And it might be. Okay, so against them, you just simply might have to fold. Now, there's another strategy, and I'll talk about this again. I don't have the hand history example, but I'll talk in generalities. Let's say you have ace-queen with 15 big blinds versus a loose aggressive opponent, or even a loose passive opponent. Do you shove all in with ace-queen? Do you raise? Let's say it's 5100. 5100. You have 15 big blinds. Your opponent has 15 big blinds, and he's a loose aggressive random player, or fishy player, and you have ace-queen. What do you do with ace-queen? So I'll pose that question to you guys. And if you didn't hear the scenario or need me to repeat it, just tell me to repeat it. So we got 4.5x, limp and 3-bet it. So scenario is small blind versus big blind. You have ace-queen. The blinds are 5,100. You have 1,500 stack. The loose, aggressive, fishy player in the big blind has a 15 big blind stack. What are you doing with ace-queen? An open shove is always going to be plus EV because ace-queen is just, it's a good hand. Okay? It's always going to be plus EV. The question is it the most plus EV play to make? And I'll tell you the answer. I'm not exactly sure. But what I'm going to tell you I'm going to give you some other plays to make that you can use when the situation presents itself. Okay, so you could open shove, yes. Yeah, so some don't give up, that's fine. So that's exactly my point, though, that I want to get into. You could shove, make life easy. Nothing wrong with that. Okay? There was a mention of limping in. That's actually a pretty good play. I actually don't mind making that play. You limp in with those hands as a trap. And again, if you know that every time you limp, a guy is going to raise over top of you, sure, go ahead and limp to induce. Exactly. So that's not a bad play. Okay? That might be a play to do. Another play is, I think somebody mentioned it earlier. Well, let me say what I don't want to do. What I don't want to do is raise to like 250 or 300. Okay, so because what happens there? You raise to 300, the guy calls, you're with a 1200 stack, he has a 1200 stack, the pot's 600, and you miss, you c-bet 300, half pot, you're down to 900, he calls, the turn misses, what are you going to do? You see, it just gets into a nasty spot. And yes, of course, they're probably going to call with worse hands, but the matter is trying to get to showdown. Okay, how do we get to showdown when we miss? And they're going to call you down with third pair, something like that. So Yep, Alan. So what I like to do is raise big pre to essentially set myself up for an all-in shove potentially on the flop. And the reason I like raising big is because you can still get these guys to call. You're still going to get calls, and then they're still potentially going to fold on the flop. There's tons of value to that. Okay? Um, that, I'm not saying one is correct over the other. What I'm giving you are all the different options. Because it's important to have all these options, because you want to make the most optimal play, so that if you find that there's a player that's calling raises nonstop, I will probably raise a third of my stack, because when he calls the third of my stack, I now have a full pot size bet to make on the flop, and it makes life really easy. And many times that's what you want to do, is make life easy. Okay? And that's actually one of the tips, is that when you're out of position, you want to make life easier on yourself, because if you don't make life easy, you don't know if you're making a long-term plus EV play. If you find yourself in nasty post-flop situations, often out of position, then you might be doing that to yourself. Yes, a third of my stack, because if he puts in a third as well, I'll have a pot size bet. So if I have a 1,500 stack, I might raise to 500. He calls 500. Now there's 1,000 in the middle, and I have 1,000 behind, and I can just jam the flop. Okay, so earlier in the game, there was a question, how do you play ace-queen against fish early in the game? So the follow-up question is, what position are we in? What are we facing? Are we in position? Are we in the blinds? Did they limp? Did they raise? What are we doing there? You are middle position, fish is in the cutoff, so out of position. Well, that's just a situation where you're going to open. There's no way I'm ever folding. You're going to raise your normal 3x from, if you're talking like 10-20, I'm going to raise to 60 with ace-queen. The interesting situation is, what do you do with ace-queen when you're in the big blind and a two fish limp in? Then what do you do? So I'll pose that question to you. You're in the big blind at 10-20, two fish limp in, and you have ace-queen. Yeah, I mean, obviously, again, if I'm in position, I'm going to ISO raise. If I'm out of position, many times I'll actually just limp in or check it in the big blind, because I don't want to find myself in too many out of position battles with even with hands like ace queen and ace jack. Sometimes even ace king. You can find yourself leaking chips potentially, especially if you're not comfortable with your post flop game. Which, again, a lot of sit and go players are not comfortable with their post flop game. It's okay to just, if you're in the blinds, just limp it in or check with those types of hands, because you raise to 100, 120, you get called, you miss, you c-bet. It can get kind of nasty. And I always tell people not to be afraid of missing flops or playing flops versus the random players, because when you hit, you're typically going to get tons of value. So it is a balance, but I'm not too concerned about having limping in and playing top pair strong, but also conserving my chips if I don't hit, especially early in the game. So that's just again that's what I'm talking about, thinking always. And when I talk about thinking, always have a game plan with what you're going to do. Again, that's another broad statement, but so many times I see people in post-flop scenarios, pre-flop, they make a play, but they don't have a plan for what happens on the turn, what happens on the river. Always set yourself up. I talk sometimes about doing a delayed c-bet versus opponents. Well, why am I doing a delayed c-bet? It's the plan to make a c-bet on the turn. Well, why am I going to make a c-bet on the turn? Maybe because I feel like I'm going to get check raised a lot on a certain board on the flop. So always have a game plan. Okay? So I'll keep moving on though. I mean, again, these situations we can talk about all day, but the point is to trying to figure out the optimal scenario versus your opponent and knowing what they typically do, you know, and how to make a plus EV play, how to make your life easy. And like I said, we can if we go back to the small blind, big blind scenario with 15 big blinds versus a loose aggressive opponent, you have a good hand. I think the worst thing to do, let's just put it this way. We can debate, should we limp to induce? Should we make a big raise pre and commit ourselves to the pot? Or should we open shove? We can have that debate. But I think what's important is you don't do the fourth option, which is let's raise to 250. Okay? You're just going to make your life miserable. So if you have a game plan and you make one of those other plays, you're going to be fine because you're thinking and you're always trying to make that correct play. If you just blindly raise the 250 out of the small blind because that's what you're supposed to do, regardless of who your opponent is, that's not a good game plan to have. You're not really thinking past the basics. Okay, you've got to get to that next level of thinking. Well, who am I up against? What's going to be the best way for me to win this pot? What's going to be the best way for me to even minimize my losses? Okay? So let's we actually talked about the first three spots a little bit, versus limpers, out of position, make life easier on yourself. I'm going to use a hand history example to talk about this one, so I'll hold off on this first point. From late position, we can look to isolate often from late position. I like to isolate at 25-50 and on. At 10-20, 15-30, I think there's actually still a lot of value to limping in with some small pocket pairs. There's obviously a lot of value to small pocket pairs, but even hands like suited aces, suited connectors, you can still limp in, try to play for a big pot, low risk, high reward. When you start getting into 25-50, 50-100, limping in typically gets eliminated from your game because it gives other people reason to shove over the top because of pot odds, and it's just costing you more of your stack. So I want to start isolating with those ace-x types of hands, queen-9. And again, this is part of the part 3 of the Crush or Egg series. I get into isolating. That could be a really nice play to add into your game. This is actually a more exploitable play against the fishier players. I mentioned this already. Versus, if you look at your table in general, if it's a loose random table, use the ABC straightforward plus EV style play, unexploitable style play. The Reggie table, play exploitable. And I'll give you one example of how you should change your game based upon the table as a whole. Let's say you have pocket fives under the gun at 10-20. Okay? If you're at a loose, fishy table, what should you do with pocket fives? I'll pose the question to you guys. Yep. So a couple of people saying limp. Yeah, and you're exactly right. Okay? We should limp because, one, they're not going to exploit our limp. Two, we want to encourage as many of these guys as possible to get into the pot so that when we hit our set, there's a good chance we can get somebody's stack. Okay? So very straightforward. But what do you do with pocket fives and pocket sevens and those types of hands when you're at a Reggie table? Do you want to limp? Raise 3x, raise standard. Yeah, I mean, it depends on position. I mean, in general, we could have the debate of should we raise? Should we even just fold those hands from under the gun at 10-20 at a tough table? Maybe. But one thing we don't want to do is limp. We don't want to limp because we're limping with our hands pretty much face up. Okay? Against other reggie type players, you're less likely to get their entire stack, for one, and again, you're playing face up, so there's really no reason to do that. Okay, so that's kind of a quick thing in changing your play based upon the table. General regs into 3-bet fold. Even in the early game, though, they might still flat. But again, what are they flatting with? When you raise, what does a reg flat you with? It might be ace king. It could be pocket pairs. So always think about what players, how people are supposed to play. If you're comfortable in your strategy, think about how you've been brought up to play. What would you call with? What would you do versus these players? Put yourself in their position. That's a great way to, when you're playing against other regs, put yourself in their position and figure out what you would do. Okay? And I agree with you. So that's exact information that we want to know, right? So that's how to change your game up essentially against when we talk about pocket pairs at a loose or reggie table. Heads up. This is another hand we're going to get into. When you're heads up versus a fish, and I guess there's a kind of a pun intended here, but don't let them off the hook easy. If you're playing against a fishier player and you're 20 big blinds deep and you're heads up, don't call it all in with a marginal hand, because they're going to spew their chips to you. They're bad players for a reason. Don't make a really marginal plus EV play, what you think might be plus EV play for a 20 big blind stack, because I think that's just letting them off the hook. That's making life easier on them. You're going to be able to put yourself in much more plus EV scenarios versus bad players. So why call it all in for 20 big blinds with ace deuce because you think your ace is ahead? There's no reason to put yourself in that scenario. That's, again, just a broad example. Versus regs, you can take those thin edges because they're going to have very good ranges. It's going to be tougher to get chips off of them potentially if you think they're a really good player. So if you're in a spot where maybe ace deuce would be a call, a really marginal call, but it's okay against tougher players. So I just wanted to go through that and give you some, like I said, some broad examples, things to think about when you're at your table, and not just when you have a pocket pair you have to limp in every single time under the gun. No, it should be based upon the players at the table. Loose table, limp. Tighter table, raise or even fold. So any questions on these quick tips? All right. So what I want to get into is a situation that was brought up in the forum. I'm not sure if you guys, I posted the link. I'm not sure if you guys had a chance to look at this. I'll kind of just paraphrase what this question was about. And this was in reference to the Crush the Reg series part 4, where I talk about should we raise or should we shove versus a reggie player. And if you remember from the video, I talked about how when you have 10 big blinds, it can be much more plus EV to just raise fold or raise call rather than just playing a push fold style of play. So the question was, essentially, is it better with hands like Jack 10 suited? Is it better to shove all in with them for, let's say, 11 or 12 big blinds than raise fold? Or because raising and then calling the shove is not as good as shoving all in? Because versus their range, let's say, again, Jack 10 suited, just won't necessarily, you don't really want to be calling with it at that point. It's better to shove it because it's a strong hand. So I get what the question is. Okay, so you have the same question? So let me, to do this, I'll talk about it in general, then I'll go through some hands. So if you remember from the video, the whole point was, even if you have a good hand like Jack 10 suited, now again, it depends on the situation. Are you chip EV, dollar EV, whatever. I'm going to do a specific example for like a 9-man game. But in general, the question is really, if you're against an opponent, is there, and again, we're going to assume it's a reg, they're not going to flat, is their 3-betting range going to be any wider than their all-in calling range? And if so, how much wider? If it's exactly the same, which many times I assume it is, like when you have 9 or 10 big blinds, the big blind typically assumes no fold equity, so you can go ahead and raise, and therefore the 3-betting range, some people will say even the 3-betting range might be tighter, thinking you're a little bit stronger, but let's not assume that they're tighter, because that only helps our cause. If you assume that a 3-betting range is equal to an all-in calling range, then it's always, 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 always. I don't usually say always and deal in absolutes, but it's always more profitable to raise than to shove all in. And then make a determination of whether to call or fold. And that's where we can start getting into some calculations. But the most important thing to do is raise and not shove. You have to base this upon, yes, an assumed range. If you don't know your opponent's range, then it might be better to take the unexploitable route. I get that. But if you're against a reg who's playing 12-10 and their 3-betting range is like 5%, then it's almost always better to just raise. And then based upon how tight you might think he is, yeah, you have to figure out the correct calling range. And that's what I did in the one video. I gave a base calling range based upon, I think it was like 20%. But let's do that. Let's get into some calculations. But what I want to say is, and what we'll go through, is that the raise, fold, raise, call game is going to yield more profitable results in the long run than the push, fold game when you're dealing with reggy types of players. Now, I want to give this little warning here about this type of play. And this goes back to thinking and knowing how your opponent perceives you. Let's say I'm up against a reg who I see every single day and I have 10 big blinds and I raise and he shoves and I fold. Okay? I don't even care what hands we have. I have shown him now that I can raise fold with 10 big blinds. And then we face each other again maybe later in that game and I have 10 big blinds and I raise, and he shoves, and I fold. Well, what have I just done? A lot of this strategy is based upon the fact that, one, players typically don't assume that there's much fold equity when we raise with 10 big blinds. But if we give that opponent, if we make it kind of obvious that we're raise folding nonstop with 9 or 10 big blinds, then they could take a note against us. If they're paying attention, they could take a note and say, hey, I can, every time he raises here, or not every time he raises, but I can make a note that there is some fold equity with, even with 10 big blinds. And I bring this up because this situation occurred. It was literally two guys in our same Skype chat. One started 3-betting the other because he realized that he was raise folding a ton with 10 big blinds. And what I would say to the other player who was opening is, you then need to change your game again. Maybe the next time you open, do it with a hand you're going to call off. Understand that you might need to widen your calling range now. Or maybe go ahead and play a little bit more unexploitable versus that type of player, because that player might be exploiting you now. So that's where, okay, I've mentioned that this raise call strategy or raise fold strategy is the more optimal strategy compared to push fold. And that's based upon our assumption of how our opponent's supposed to play. Well, if we take that one step further and say our opponent has now changed, we need to change. So that requires us to think and always try to stay one step ahead of our opponents. Okay? So with that little public service announcement in mind, let's get into some calculations. So what I did was, and you guys can change, you might say it's tighter, looser, whatever. What I did was, everybody has relatively equal stacks, 9-man game, 6 players left, 100, 200 pre-ante. We have Jack 10 suited with 10 big blinds. We push all in. I gave our opponent a 22% calling range, which is Ace 3 off, Ace Deuce suited, King 10 suited, King Jack off, pocket 3s. Maybe he's tighter, maybe he's looser. I'd say it's a pretty good average range for a 9-man game where there's ICM involved. Anybody wholeheartedly disagree with that? Right. You push these hands instead of 2xing and folding. Well, are you assuming that the player would 3-bet you wider? With 10 big blinds. See, I see, this is where I totally disagree with that. 100% disagree with, if you're against a reg who has either never seen you do this, or let's put yourself in the big blind. Put yourself in the big blind, and a guy raises the 220 in the small blind with 10 big blinds or 9 big blinds. I will almost never assume I have much fold equity unless I know, for example, unless I know specifically, because I've done it to him, because I've seen him fold it before. And if it's the example, though, of if you play against a guy every single day and he does it to you, sure, that's fine. But then the question is the 3-betting you wide enough to justify shoving all in? And as you know, go ahead and keep typing Nuno. So I'll just talk about this hand. So as you can see, it's a pretty plus EV play. You know, shoving is nothing wrong with shoving. Okay. Where this strategy actually really shows its profitability in terms of raise folding or raise calling is when you get into the 7-deuce type of hands, because then you can turn a plus EV situation into, or a negative EV situation into a plus EV one. Okay. Because what I'll show you is, okay, Jack 10 suited here. Now let's do raise fold versus that same range. So what I did was, this is Cardrunners EV for those who haven't seen it. I set up the same exact situation. I even put that we're going to, let's not go to 450. Let's just say we'll go to 400. If we give him the same exact range, I actually think there might have been some extra couple hands in there, but around 22%. Raise fold, it's 1.04% compared to 0.74%. That's 0.3 percentage points higher. Okay? That's real money. That's real profitability. That's more money you're putting into your pocket. Okay? So that, but then the question is, well, what if he is 3-betting wider? Let's give him any ace. Let's give him all the other Broadway hands. You know, so let's increase his range another, 8%. I have no idea. I'm just kind of going off the seat of my pants here. Let's see what that does. That's still more profitable than shoving all in. So at what point does it stop becoming more profitable? Let's go to 30%. And again, am I assuming that with 10 big blinds, 9 big blinds, that someone's going to 3-bet me with these types of hands? Because they should assume no fold equity. .76. So even if I go to 30%, an extra 10%, it's still slightly better than pushing or folding. Okay, okay. So I think this is a very good point to make. No, no, you said you're on the bubble. So I think that's actually very important to point out. The bubble is a totally different scenario. Okay? Is the sound better now? Okay. The bubble is a totally different scenario because you're not really exploiting the opponent so much as you're exploiting the situation. Yes, it's a combination of opponent and situation, but if you're playing a 45-man bubble or an 18-man bubble, those bubble factors are the highest of any sit and go besides a double or nothing. Okay? So, okay, so it's an 18-man. So the bubble factor is 2 on average on a bubble in that scenario. If that's the case, yes, you can 3-bet because if the guy is just min-raising there and you've seen him fold, then that should give you free reign to 3-bet him a ton because you're exploiting the ICM of the situation. So I think that is a good thing to bring up. I'm not talking about massively high ICM bubble scenarios because when you're in a bubble scenario, you should actually be playing exploitable if you're exploiting somebody else's open, but if you're against another reg, you should be playing more unexploitable because it's a situation that everybody knows now they can exploit. Okay? Exactly. You're exactly right. But that's more the situation of exploiting this scenario. Okay? So let's it's actually probably a good video to make as a follow-up to that in terms of dealing with high ICM scenarios. Because if I have ace-jack, I don't want to min-raise ace-jack if I'm second in chips into the chip leader on a bubble because race calling is an ICM disaster. And he can 3-bet me with 7-deuce offsuit and tell me he's 3-betting with 7-deuce offsuit, and I might not be able to call. Okay, so yes, I get that. But in general, in a situation like this, 6-handed, you're blind versus blind, 9, 10 big blinds, very rarely will somebody assume fold equity. So if we get back to this scenario, what I wanted to show is if we have Jack-10 suited, yeah, it looks good. We know that we have equity if a player calls this. But that's not even what I care about. What I care about is what's more profitable, race folding or even sometimes race calling, depending upon an opponent's 3-betting range. But the question you have to ask is, are they going to 3-bet you any wider? And if so, how wide to justify shoving? As you can see here, if he's going to call with 22% versus an all-in, he needs to increase his 3-betting range, all the way up to 30%, which I'm never assuming anybody does until I know that they do it. And again, that's the other point. If I was to go play a game right now, okay, and there's a player to my left who I look up, he's a winning player, and he's playing 14-12 and is a reg, my default strategy is to do this, is to raise. Okay? Only when I know that he's capable of 3-betting me wide and frequently in that same exact scenario will I change to this strategy. Because, like you said, hey, that other guy, he didn't even adapt to you. If they're not going to adapt to me, I'm going to keep making the pusher fold, the race fold, race call play. So is that clear of when to use which strategy and why? If this was a random opponent, so let me deviate. If this is a random opponent who I have no idea what his stats are, he's a losing player or whatever, I am shoving all in. I'm making this plus EV play because I know it's plus EV. I have no idea if a min raise from here is going to be plus EV because he could flat us, he could do all sorts of stuff, which I don't want to put myself in position to have happen. So that's where you need to know when to deviate. Loose, fishy player, make the plus EV play, and I'm going to shove. Otherwise, versus a reg, I'm going to be raise, folding, raise, calling. Okay? Make sense? Anybody agree, disagree? And let me also say, if there's antes involved, this makes the raise fold play much more profitable, or raise call, because they need to 3-bet wider to devalue the play because there's so many more chips in the pot. And if you have questions as to this strategy and how it applies to your own game, because obviously I did a 9-man game here pre-ante with 6 players. We could have, it's like an infinite number of scenarios. What if we have 8 big blinds? What if there's 7 players? What if we're on the bubble? If a situation like this comes up, post it in the forum under, in the appropriate thread, for, let's say, part 4 of the Crush the Reg series. Post it, say, hey, was this situation profitable or not? How will we know if they 3-bet wider? Well, it's typically going to be versus players that you see every single day, right? It's going to be against the reg who in your Hold'em manager or whatever you've got 5,000 hands on, whatever. One easy way is, again, Hold'em manager 2, the versus hero stat. Look at his 3-bet versus hero compared to his other 3-betting stat. Is there a 10% difference? If so, then he must be picking it up. So I have Hold'em manager 1 as well. So okay, so that's not one of them. The other way to do it is, if you think that a player is 3-betting you wider, then you have to start taking notes on that guy. Go into your database after the game, look him up, filter for 3-betting spots versus that player when you opened up and he 3-bet you, and you could see, is he doing it more frequently? Do you actually get a chance to see a hand he 3-bets you with? Okay, and that's how you have to start getting a sense. So even if you never see a hand that he shows down, you have to start getting a sense of, is he just 3-betting me more frequently? Just the overall frequency will tell you. So that's where no caddy can help if you're playing too many tables, or also if you're not playing enough tables and you can pay attention, then you just have to take a note yourself. That's really the only ways you can do it. Stats, database research, take notes. So any other questions on this? Makes sense. I know it's still a difficult concept. I've repeated myself so many times, I feel, in videos about this concept, but I repeat it so much because I think it's so important that if you're, I know there's a lot of 18-man guys. If you're an 18-man guy playing at an 8% ROI, well, if you want to get to 10%, 12%, 15%, it involves incorporating stuff like this and incorporate it appropriately and all the other exploitable strategies correctly. If you just say, well, I'm going to push here because I know it's plus EV, if you know who you're up against, you can make a more plus EV. It's about not being content with making a plus EV play. It's striving for the most optimal play. And that's what we're after. I'll bring up another hand real quick. This was a hand you could find on 2+2. It was posted. There's a guy in our Skype chat posted, and I usually don't respond on 2+2 a whole lot, but I responded. I'll post the link in here afterwards, or I'll post the link in now so you can review it afterwards. Essentially, the situation is, and it relates to a conversation we had earlier about, I think it's a 9-man game. We're at 25-50. We have ace-king in the small blind. We get 2 limpers. A guy who limps and another guy who calls. What do we do with ace-king? And really the question came down to, I think it's a 9-man game. It looks like a 9-man game. The question came down to, what should you do post-flop? His question was actually a post-flop question because he raised to 300, got to post-flop, missed the flop again, and of course an opponent called. missed the flop, c-bet small, got called, missed the turn, checked. See, you could see how messy this got post flop if you could just follow here. Raised to 300, bet, got called, missed, check, bet, fold. Next thing you know, you're sitting with a 1500 big blind or 1500 stack or 30 big blind stack. You finish the hand with what? A 900 stack? Something like that. Or geez, even 500. Yeah, that 900,000 chip stack. No, I think it's too small. See, a lot of other people recommend it going smaller, but all that really does is many times is create headaches for yourself out of position. So you guys can read through this, and a lot of people are saying go small, and you can read the comment I wrote. And this is, again, like I said, most people don't advocate it. I would have gone to 400, between 400 and 500. Give myself an opportunity. If anybody wants to call that, hey, good for you. Go ahead and call. Now I'm going to shove pretty much every flop. And if you fold, that's tons of value. If you call, I probably have outs. But what I wanted to do was make life easy and not find myself in a really nasty post-flop situation where I potentially leave myself with a 900 stack at 2550. Okay? Do you have to make this play? Yes, he does advocate that play. I think I think we've talked about that before. So you say you don't like it. The question is, why don't you like it? If you're up against a player who's playing 75-10, I don't like limping behind at this stage. I think there's too many chips in the pot that we're leaving out there to play it passively. If I'm playing against a guy and he's like 75-10, I'm going to raise big, get him to call because that's what they do. Shoving would have been okay, but I think there's actually potentially missed value because I think that they will call raises, big raises, more often than they call a shove. Now, we'd have to do the calculations of, well, still, is a shove better or not? And fold the flop sometimes. If we raise big, am I ever folding the flop? If I raise big, my intention is not to fold the flop. It's to get it in on pretty much every single flop. Again, it's a non-standard play that I do against fishy players to, one, make my life easy, two, to get value. It's quite simple. You're still going to get value. Yeah, absolutely. I could probably go through my database and show you many hands where that's occurred. And that's the only reason I advocate it, because I use it. I know other people that use it, and it works really well. And even if they don't fold what if they miss? They're going to miss 2/3 of the time. They're going to fold the flop. Even if they call, you have ace-king. You have a good hand. You might either be ahead of them if they decide they're just going to keep calling, or even if they call, you have outs. There's a ton of value to the play. And that's why I like it. Again, is it a play that you 100% have to do every single time? Of course not. It's a play I use in very special situations versus fishy players who limp, and I think I'm a little bit too deep to shove, but I could raise big and get myself to commit my stack on the flop. Yeah, I would do it with like ace-queen, potentially ace-jack, hands like that. Yep. So, is this a strategy that you're ever going to see advocated in other forums and other videos? Most likely not. It's important to understand why to do it and when to do it. I thought this was a really good time to do it. Unknown players limped in. There's, like 200 chips in the pot. You have ace-king. You most likely obviously have the best hand. You could either raise small and get into most likely a post-flop battle out of position. You could shove, which may not be... I like shoving better than I like raising small, but I think you might be missing out on some value. And I like the combining both of them, raising to like 400 to 500, and making a post flop situation much easier out of position. Is it going to work every single time? Of course not. But there's not one strategy that works every single time. It's a special play for special people. Special people meaning the bad players that you face that are likely to call a 10x raise or an 8x raise and go from there. Would I use it against a guy that's playing 22-20? Probably not. Those aren't likely the players that are susceptible to that type. But if a guy's playing 50-20, you're damn right I'm going to make this play. And that's what I mean about identifying player types and changing your play based upon them. Whether they're regs, fish, ultra fish. So hopefully that makes sense. Like I said, some of it sounds weird. Raise folding with 9 big blinds to most people sounds like a fishy play. Raising 10x sounds like a fishy play. But the question is, why are we doing it? We're doing it because we think that's the optimal play at the time to exploit those tendencies of the player. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I'm sure sometimes people think I'm nuts for recommending some of these plays, and that's fine. I try to back it up as much as possible with calculations to justify it. This type of play is tough to justify because there's a lot of variables and assumptions. But if you have a game plan for why you're doing it, I think that's really the key component. So, any questions about this stuff? Sure. I'm sure people know me as a fish as well. And that's fine. But I just showed you why race folding with 10 big blinds and 9 big blinds and 8 big blinds sometimes can be the much more optimal scenario. The point, though, is you need to use it in the right spot. If you just go out there and race fold the next time you have 10 big blinds in the small blind, regardless of the opponent, you're making a mistake. It's got to be versus a reg who's not going to 3-bet significantly wider, which they usually aren't, and who's not going to flat your raise and force you to play post flop. That's a very good assumption to make with most players. So hopefully this is helpful, guys. But that was kind of the point. We wanted to identify players and figure out how to change your game based upon those players. So hopefully this was helpful. I'll be around. Message me if you have any questions on this stuff. So if there's no questions now, I'll leave it with that. All right, cool. Good luck at the tables, guys. Talk to you later.